On the road of game criticism, sometimes people lose sight of what's important to look at when looking for the biggest gems and worst games along the way. Sure, you want every game to be a diamond, but sometimes an imperfect emerald ends up making a bigger impact on you. Sure, it may be rugged, it may be unrefined, but it ends up having a specific glow that you can't take your eyes off of. To me, the original Witch and the 100 Knight was one of those games. It had major flaws, the gameplay got repetitive, but for me, it was still memorable. And I know exactly why that was. The writing behind the character Metallia. The interesting narrative behind her character, how dark and yet how interesting her backstory was. She was the reason to play the game and define the game for me. So it was interesting to hear that the game was going to get a sequel, but with a whole new cast and a whole new storyline. The Witch and the 100 Knight 2 came out on March 27th, 2018 for $49.99 on the PS4. It's an action RPG involving witches, holy valkyries, and a cross-dressing butler raven with a southern accent. All your standards for a Japanese action RPG, of course. But before I begin this review, this key was received from the publisher for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that due to FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? So the real question though is, will it be the witching hour for 100 Knight 2? Or will it find something to keep itself around? Let's find out. The reason that I ultimately liked the original game is where we will start here, the story. Right from the get-go, those who played the original game may be a little bit confused, and rightly so. At the core of the story are the witches themselves, like at the first game. I mean, see the title. But these witches aren't what you'd expect. Not directly, at least. See, witches aren't just forces of evil in The Witch and the 100 Knight 2. They are a literal disease on society. And a literal disease. Yes, being a witch is a disease this time around. Only young girls can get the disease, and unfortunately for our main protagonist Amelie, her sister Milm has contracted the disease at the start of the game. You could tell those who are affected by the closed third eye on their heads. Once an afflicted eye opens, it's witch time. And no, not Bayonetta witch time, but more on slowing down things later. Needless to say, Amelie and her sister become immediate outcasts, as those who become witches basically cause death and destruction for anyone around. Due to the plague, Amelie ends up joining up with the Vice Ritter and the Holy Valkyries, looking for a cure to help Milm. Consider the Holy Valkyries a combination of a medical team and soldiers designed to fight against the witch disease. They are led by Theodore, a prophet whose oddly accurate yet cryptic predictions are a little bit too on the mark at times. The Vice Ritter have taken Amelie in, and are even willing to perform surgery to remove Milm's third eye before it opens, while making Amelie a Valkyrie in training. Well, you could probably predict what happens next. Despite the surgery attempt, Milm's third eye opens, and she turns into the evil witch Chelka, ready to cause havoc and destruction around her. Well, sorta. Milm is actually still alive, as both her soul and Chelka's are ending up in the same body. The newly born Chelka has a little bit of magic power, but not a whole lot, so she ends up creating the 100 Knight as her minion to do her bidding, who's a mysterious spirit that fights on his summoner's behalf. The strongest element of this plot is easy to see if you have a third eye: Amelie and her struggle. She's a Holy Valkyrie apprentice at the start of the game, and she has the utmost respect for the Vice Ritter, with them taking her in when times are tough. She wants to earn the cure for the Holy Valkyries and perform the surgery on the transformed Chelka. But with Chelka being, well, a witch and all, she ends up having to hide various pieces of information from the Vice-Ritter and do what she can to get any piece of information to help her sister. Amelie is pulled into multiple directions and having trouble dealing with what she has to do, and that's fun to watch. Her emotional turmoil is touching, especially because it comes from such a place of love and purity. I will admit, however, that it is hard for me to talk about some of those elements due to how spoiler-specific they are to the plot, but I like the way that the game sets up possibilities for what could happen early on in the story, and the hinting of what Amelie means in the plot in particular. Things like her creepy obsession with Milm and being close to her. Yeah, she's a sister and she wants to protect her, but it goes to the point that it almost implies an even closer than a sisterly love thing, to the point where you're like, wait a minute, is Amelie a witch? Is she evil? What's going on here? Sadly, I don't think the story ever really hits that potential with Amelie or a good amount of these protagonists. There's a lot of drop plot points that I wanted to see go in a more erratic direction, but instead the game seemed to play it a bit safe with some of these reveals. I'll get more into that in a little bit, but I will say this at least. The other Holy Valkyries did have a lot more life to them compared to the rest of the characters, and was a strength of the game. In fact, the whole dynamic between Amelie and the Holy Valkyries is one of the biggest strengths. All of them are good characters with some interesting quirks. For example, there's Zoe and her alchemy-infused body, which seems to fuel her deep hatred of witches, of what it's done to her, and made her into a drill sergeant type character. Then there's Lisa's strange lying detecting abilities, and her infatuation with Theodore running so deep, and why she considers him more than just maybe a love interest. There's a sense of mystery about many of these characters, but what they have is an innate synergy with each other. They work off each other to make the story move forward rather well, especially in the first half of the game. But let's not forget the best character in my mind, and it's a surprising one for me. Hunin Mugen. Honestly, I usually get really bored of comic relief characters in RPG plots. They start to wear rather quickly on me, and usually don't get well involved in the actual plot, meaning that they're sort of pointless. Not the case for Hunin Mugen, whose unique combinations of quirks and characteristics support other characters and make him important to the proceedings, but allows him to shine in the humor role as well.
Welcome back, dearie. My goodness, you look terrible. That is a criminal waste of a pretty face. You must be so tired. I'll draw a bath for you, honey. You need a soak. I'll put some goat's milk and aromatherapy oils in there so you can do your body right. Oh, I almost forgot. Here. This is for you. This soap is made from the fat of a gold-haired winged pig. Use this, and your skin will be as soft as my down feathers.
However, even with some of the strengths, there will be a lot of comparisons to the original game here, and sadly, I think the game ultimately lives in the shadow of the first game when it comes to plot. What's funny about this is that when it comes to characters themselves, The Witch and the 100 Knight 2 has a lot better overall characters in the big picture in my mind. Sure, you had good characters in the first game, such as Visco and Luciacini, but I'm drawn to the second game's characters a little bit more. But there's a couple of major problems when you compare the games to each other, and specifically, one that stands out a little bit too much in my taste.
Oh, really? You already said you'd kill me, but now I get a stake of justice? And you call me, the Swamp Witch, third rate? After failing to capture me? Your ignorance is pathetic. Fine. I'll teach your body to understand the greatness of this third-rate Swamp Witch. 100 Knight, shove this right up that dog's swampy ass.
The problem at the core of The Witch and the Hundred Knight 2 story, in my mind, is simple. The difference between Chelka and Metallia. In a market saturated with games right now, Metallia was actually a nice draw due to how evil she was, but the reasoning behind that evil. Yes, she did some horrible, horrible things, but the way she learned from books with no moral element of it made a lot of sense of how she was as a person. Sure, there have been anti-heroes in games before, of course, and there have been evil characters, but Metallia stood out because of the boldness of the writing. Despite some critics not seeing it, it was fun to follow her. She was evil, she was vile, but it did have a message, and it made you think. Are we a product of our upbringing? Maybe true evil isn't necessarily something that we're in full control of, but we're shaped by. Chelka, on the other hand, is supposedly evil because she was born that way? Sure, Chelka has no qualms about blowing up a whole castle, but it's the motivation and the reasoning behind it. Metallia had story built into how she got the way she was. Chelka is evil because the story tells us she's evil. Hell, let's be frank, Chelka's supposed bitter tongue and crazy threats pale in comparison to Metallia. Metallia held the room and did some really crazy shit. Chelka just looks like, well, it looks like Kim Jong-un compared to a sympathetic Hitler. And yes, I just used the phrase sympathetic Hitler in my review. Something's wrong here. Which also means that the redemption storyline also falls a little more flat. Don't get me wrong, Chelka converting to an ally of sorts is okay in its execution, but all I could end up thinking was, damn, I wish I was following Metallia's story. It also doesn't help that the game's overall tone is a lot less dark than the original game. There's maybe one scene that makes your skin crawl, compared to several in the original. Even the thrown in sexual language in the first game was a lot more effective than the second game's attempts, and they actually didn't feel like they fit in a couple of situations. What sucks here is that the game did hint at a lot more darker themes at times that I really wanted to see explored. Amelie's love for Milm at a couple of points gets a bit unsettling, and you wonder if there's something more past the surface. But, to be quite frank, I wonder if there was a real shift in the translation or the story direction as a whole based on the original shock and reviews of The Witch and the Hundred Knight. It feels like the darker elements that I saw, the thing about Amelie and her sister and her creepiness, and some elements of Hune and Mugen, for example, ended up a lot tamer than I think the story was trying to make. I don't want to cry censorship. I have no evidence of that to support that claim. But something about this plot makes me think that the direction that the original writing was going ended up going in a completely different direction, and that's the thing that I noticed the most. Then there's the ending. Look, there are multiple endings overall in the game, and I got the best ending the first time around, which is labeled the bad ending, mostly to the first game. Without spoiling anything, the ending felt unearned to me, and went to places that, to be honest, really didn't make sense compared to the early parts of the game. The satisfaction of seeing some characters and what they went through, it just wasn't there by the time you were finishing the game and going through the credit scenes. It just felt like the game ended. Overall, the story was a disappointment, mostly due to the fact that the last third of the game really dragged out, and the game lived in the shadow of the first game, and Metallia in particular. With the story coming up a little bit short for me, you'd hope that the gameplay could use its changes to improve from the first game. And to be upfront with you, it's a bit of a mixed bag. While there are improvements to the original formula, there's also elements that end up mirroring the original game's problems despite that. But if you haven't played the first game, The Witch and the Hundred Knight 2 is an action RPG, which has a couple of interesting concepts up its sleeve. So, the basics. You fight as the Hunter Knight, who uses a loadout of 5 weapons at a time. He takes one weapon, hits the enemy, then exchanges it for the next, up to 5 attacks in a row. It's a simple 5-hit combo, which only gets variation through the way you make your loadout, but that can get some variety on your attacks depending on how you do it. You have a basic dodge to avoid enemy attacks, and if you time it just right, you can activate a witch time sort of effect, giving you 5 seconds basically to go hog wild on your opponents, because you're also seemingly immune to damage during this portion, or at least I feel like it is. On top of that, The Witch and the Hunter Knight 2 adds one big element from the original game, the facet system. Facets are like predetermined loadouts with specific strengths and weaknesses. In the original game, you had 3 loadouts of swords, but they didn't have any themes like the second game does. For example, the Power Fortress facet does well with physical defense and the use of hammers, but sucks against any magic-based attack. Meanwhile, you have the Shinobi Assassin facet, which loves swords and resists poison well, but overall lacks in defense. You could choose up to 3 facets out of a total of 6 that you can get in the game to take with you when you go out and attack. And while you'll generally stick to the first 3 in my experience, playing to your weapon's strengths and adjusting based on a boss is something you will need to do throughout the game. The combat is simple yet straightforward, with enemies having an alright assortment of skills, ranges, and attack patterns. Granted, it's not that intense or anything you haven't seen before if you played an action RPG, but it could do the job reasonably when the challenge is right. When you're having to watch your health very carefully and avoid attacks without button mashing, the game can have a specific charm to it. The problem almost immediately on that portion, however, is getting to that balanced combat. Early on, you'll be okay with enemies giving you only a slight challenge, but you're getting used to the game's mechanics and everything, so it gets a pass. Then there's a slight difficulty bump that makes you think that the game will balance itself well over the course of combat. But no, the only way you get that on a normal basis is using this skill at your base camp, and then using this one when you get to the boss, cause you're gonna need it. At least for 50% of the game, it's one of my biggest complaints about it, that a good amount of the time, you end up just blindly working your way through it. I just have to question what was going on in the balance of this game combat-wise. One of the biggest examples of this is the use of the gigacalorie meter. Gigacalories are like energy in this game. You use them while you're walking, and use a set amount when dodging an attack. You can regain them by killing enemies with a finishing attack, and you can even use them to regain health by sacrificing a good amount of it. On the flip side, if you get KO'd by an enemy, you'll respawn at the start of an area, sacrificing a chunk of gigacalories along the way. The idea here is that you're supposed to fear the gigacalorie meter, because if you get KO'd when you've got 0 gigacalories, you'll lose everything in your stomach. All your items are gone, and you'll be weaker overall. Now on the surface, that seems like a good mechanic to have you deal with enemies in a timely manner. It would put pressure on the player not to be reckless, but he still has to get through the area. There's just one small, itsy bitsy problem with that. Let me show you.
How's this? Yeah. Yeah. How's this? How's this?
If it wasn't obvious by that clip, you're too fast. You could just walk by enemies, even big bosses. Sure, you can't expect to make progress in the game when you have to fight and gain experience, but if you're in trouble and need to use a mana fountain to get out at this point, it's not a problem. Just walk by everything and come back later to get some levels. Save your items. The gigacalorie meter in this game is a joke. Until the boss fights. which luckily are the highlight of the game. Not only are the bosses requiring you to think about your loadout smartly and take careful consideration of your attacks and dodges, but you'll feel the gigacalorie meter weighing down on you and actually putting you in a bit of a panic at times. I feel like most of the talented designers working on this project were put into these sections, as there are several fights that push you to your limit, whether it be having you play keep away against an enemy's onslaught, or timing your hammer attacks in very specific ways to avoid incoming attacks. With every step forward that the game had in terms of the combat here, I felt like it took another 2 steps back. Compared to the first game, the skills in this game meant something, especially because you could actually use them a reasonable amount of time. Hell, it was fun gaining more of them with the consume attack like with the gigacalories, extending them beyond the standard 100 that you got, and going hog wild on enemies with sword slashes or a huge thunderbolt. 80% of the skills were well designed here, taking into account short continuous damage like the 100 slashes here, or a zoning feature of these fire pillars. Sure, the remaining 20% had very small applications, but there were times where all the points you put into a specific skill were foolish, because its one weakness ended up making a huge difference in taking tons of damage. Well, except for the big hammer one. That one seemed to work no matter what the situation, I felt. Yeah, I could take some damage after the hammer hit, but it did so much damage most of the time that I didn't really need to really worry about that. But on the flip side, one of the things I loved about the original game was that really skilled players could really take advantage of the timing of switching weapons. You could switch loadouts mid-combo, so you could use a hammer instead of a sword on the next attack. They've taken it away in this game, and I do understand the reason why. The loadouts have specific strengths, meaning that you could really just do overpowered attacks without any weaknesses most of the time. However, that's also a curse, because that means the 3 loadouts start to get repetitive, and start to play out the same way when going through a section. You'll have to fight specific enemies in specific ways, but that's the only real way to get through to them. But it start to really bore you after a while. Yeah, fighting golems was fun at first, but when I had to do it the same way over and over and over again, I started to drool from the mouth, cause I really don't have to think about it. And that's the biggest problem this game has. It drags and drags and drags, especially in the 3rd act. Even players of the first game will notice the repetition almost immediately, because unlike the first game, it takes you a while to get to a new area you haven't seen before. See this forest-like maze? Get ready to see a hell of a lot of it, with maybe different shades of color involved, because you're going to be fighting in it a lot. And even very early on, you'll notice very similar configuration sections of the forest you'll be walking through. Sure, the game tries to give you a little bit of enemy depth early on, but it's not enough to notice that you just killed your 10,000th golem. This is most definitely notable in the 2nd and 3rd acts of the game, with one moment specifically standing out to me: a boss fight with the same patterns and model than a regular enemy. And I'm not talking about a situation where you have an early game boss that comes back as a regular enemy later on in the game. By the time you've gotten to this point as well, you've figured out how exactly to kill every regular enemy rather easily, and how to exploit them and their ranges. Really, the only real challenge becomes execution at this point, because some of the enemies will have insane amounts of health, especially the mini-bosses that can kill you in 1 or 2 hits. Regardless, it turns boring. Really, really boring. But, oh god, the last part of the game. The last boss fight. Now, in the original game, there were 3 endings, and the technically bad ending that was the hardest to get was a major pain in the side. Enemies were a bit stronger and kicked your ass. Now, luckily for my first review of the game, it was a remaster type game, which means I could compare or see more data on if that challenge was warranted or not, or give a reason for it. I don't have that here. And well, I did get the bad ending. It's just that, well, it took a lot longer than I expected. A hell of a lot longer. Let me put it this way. The last section of the game dropped the game an entire 8 to 10 points in the overall review. The combination of the repetitive nature and the sheer amount of time that I ended up grinding not only delayed this review a long time, but made me so gosh darn angry. It wasted my time. I did the same thing over and over again. It was sort of like an MMO, except it was even worse than that in terms of the repetitiveness. I'm sorry, I just don't understand what they were thinking in this last portion. Let me move on to something else. Speaking of MMO type systems, the game does add loot drops with weapons that range from regular to legendary. This helps things a little bit because it is always exciting to get a new weapon, even if the amount of different iterations of that weapon aren't that high. Now, it's not anything special in the genre, however, but the leveling system using reagents does bring a little bit more to the table, only because of how ridiculous you can end up overpowering your weapon. Getting a new legendary and pumping it full of catalyst and making it an ultimate super weapon is fun for a little bit, if not necessary for the final act. While I appreciate that the game tried to make some changes to the formula and was somewhat successful in the process, it failed to address some of the more important weaknesses of the first game, the repetitiveness. In fact, it enhanced it. That killed the game despite some changes to the weaponry and skill system that did help the game in certain battles, and good boss battles in the long haul. Now, you expect RPGs to have some repetition, but not to this extent. Okay, the technical section of this review will be very short. The Witch and the Hundred Knight 2 runs at 60 FPS, and while that's good for an action RPG, you really won't notice for the most part because of how pulled back the action is and how small it seems. It also feels like the action is slow at times. As for the stability of that 60 FPS, it's good for 95% of the game, but there are times the game does start to slow down with some of the effects the game has or the amount of enemies on screen. I noticed it most in this section of the game, and before you ask, I'll get to this presentation in a second. As for crashes, which were apparently a problem with the original PS3 version of the first game, that wasn't really the case here. It did crash once at the end of the game, at a spot that was really bad considering I had gone through a huge section that had taken 20 minutes without having a save option. So that frustrated me a little bit, but overall, it's rather stable. Finally, here's your list of options for the game. Now, almost immediately, one thing may jump out to you: the resolution option. This is a PS4 game, not a PC game. I'm assuming this has to do with the PS4 Pro, but it defaults to the high quality on the PS4 regular. You got standard sound options, and I like the inclusion of the camera rotation speed option here. Overall, nothing to write home about in the technical section of the game. Finally, let's talk a little bit about the presentation. It's not bad. It's not necessarily the greatest either. It has its strengths, which some of it is really the character design. Even some of the more generic get-ups have some interesting elements to them, like Amelie's base design, for example. The syringe here for the cure-like nature of the Holy Valkyries, and in particular what that cure means to her, yeah, it's good characterization. I love the artwork in the cutscenes. Something about all the colors pop out here, and it's the simple details, like the lighter colors on the end of Amelie's hair, or the eyelashes painted on by Hunan Mugen himself, that help really add small, subtle details to the characters and help with characterization. It's then balanced well with over-the-top elements like the bows on both Hunan Mugen and Amelie, or the bell on Hundred Knight's belly. Honestly, I'd love to see a visual novel in this style because I really think it could succeed. And frankly, the artwork is fantastic. But as for the in-game models, I'm sorry, they are poor in most cases. Part of it is the amount of detail that the game gives on the model corresponding with the lighting and color choices. Now, sure, in a cutscene like this, it's a little bit more tolerable and actually gets a little bit of good detail there. But during gameplay, with the camera pulled back all the way, you lose that detail and things start to blend together muddily. On top of that, the in-game effects can be really meh. The hue on the projectiles, for example, starts to blend into the background, making it really hard to see during gameplay. It's difficult to see animations at times with some of the color choices and distance as well, and that affects the gameplay directly in a negative way. It makes my job harder to know when to dodge attacks, or even if an attack is coming. But even beyond normal, there are times where the game gets really, really ugly. I get that there's a gas or fog-like effect in this area, but the color choices here make me sick to look at, especially with the bleed that ends up happening with the colors. I ran through this section of the game, not because of the fact that the gameplay was hard, because I didn't want to look at this screen. I mean, just look at it. It actually makes me feel nauseous. As for voice acting, I didn't really have any problems here, and while there are lines that definitely have the wrong inflection and emotion attached to them at times, there are some great performances overall. Milne brings through a great performance as the young girl that needs to be brave in overwhelming circumstances, and Amelie puts a consistent great performance as the main protagonist. One performance stands out, Hunan Mugen. Yes, I know, the humor character, but here's the thing, his accent, even though it's a little bit off, is still frickin' hilarious. Just take a listen and hear what I'm talking about on the English voices.
Are you here to take me back home? But I can't go back. I gotta go to a video. I bit my tongue. I'm okay. I'm not gonna cry. Not until after I get the magic crystal from the video. I didn't cry when I got that mana flower for Sissy's birthday either.
Baths? Oh, I've just been so busy with housework. I can barely find the time. The best I get is a quick splash or two. But we birds make do, don't we?
That's what I thought. You stink. Like a wild animal. Can't you do something about your unpleasant smell?
Well, I never. The problem is your nose. It's just too sensitive.
I doubt that. With my magic sealed away, my sense of smell is barely more powerful than an average woman's.
Hey, don't count me dead yet.
Sophie!
Sophie, welcome back.
My deepest apologies. The men in my command died in vain. I considered sacrificing my own life rather than return in shame, but I realized that this life was not mine to give. It belongs to Lord Theodore, who gave it to me. So I swallowed my pride to stand before.
Sound design is a bit of a crapshoot here. There is some good quality sounds at certain points, like the sound of a hammer coming down on several enemies, hitting the ground with this thud, or the grunts of a Hunter Knight as he throws himself at enemies once again. On the other hand, some sounds get overshadowed in the process, making it hard to hear some projectiles being launched, or even when the attacks are actually launched by the enemies. To me, the sound effects really only do one thing: enhance the presentation. And you may say to yourself, Dragnix? That's what they're supposed to do. Well, that's one of their functions. But the thing is, it also should enhance the gameplay experience in question. And sometimes, it gets in the way of that. Take a listen and hear what I'm talking about. As to the music, I'm gonna be completely honest with you. About 80% of the music, I don't remember in this game. I mean, it's not that the music is necessarily bad, it's just that it didn't stick out to me in most cases, except for a few songs here and there. Especially the lava theme that was driven into my head over and over the course of the game. But for that other 20% of the music, it is rather lovely, and something I will be adding to my programming playlist just for how it seems to set the mood of the room. Take a listen and hear what I'm talking about.
Did? Don't jump to any conclusions. I found a very interesting account in one of these Vice Ritter documents. I wanted to perform an experiment on you to see if it's true.
Overall, the presentation is hit and miss. When it hits, it's an extra base hit, and there's some really strong elements to it. But when it misses, it strikes out. It makes you want to put the game down because it's an assault on the senses. This is odd for me because NIS America games are usually consistent in this area. But hey, at least some of this game will stick with me. In the end, despite the game setting up some strong possibilities and looking good to begin with, I was ultimately disappointed in The Witch and the 100 Knight 2. The game started to really drag in the second half of the game, despite some interesting plot points. And while the boss battles were worth noting, it just couldn't keep me entertained, especially when it free fell in the last chapter of the game. On top of that, it couldn't hold a candle to the legacy of Metallia and her story, despite Amelie's story still being solid and worth listening to. Unfortunately, I can't recommend Witch and the 100 Knight 2 at full price, even for the most dedicated players, as the game comes in at a 66 out of 100, meaning that it's worth a purchase at sale price, but nothing more. Now, like with all of my reviews, that doesn't include my enhancer system, which focuses on more subjective tastes to adjust the review for the type of player you are. If you fall into the following categories, add or subtract the appropriate score to the base score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to the description or this chart for where the game lies in your buyability score now. Anyway, I'm unsure what I'll be focusing on next review-wise, but with work bearing down on me for the next month or so to get a project done, I'll have to be creative with what I'm able to work on. I'll try to live stream a little more to balance things out coverage-wise in the meanwhile. Again, thanks for being patient with me, and leave any comments on this video in the comment section below. But for now, this is Dragnix signing out, and as always, keep on gaming.